Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. My name is Corey. Some people call me Corey Stay Trapping, with the Trap Talks podcast, where we discuss the intersection of culture and tech with venture capitalists, like we have here today, Shruti Shah. Did I pronounce that correct?
You did.
Cool. And so yeah, we discussed the intersection of culture and tech, right? That looks different for everybody. The way it looks for a VC is different from, a restaurant owner. And today, we have the honor of, speaking with Shruti Shah. She's a former Carolina grad like myself. And when I say Carolina, I mean UNC-Chapel Hill, where Jordan went. So, we gotta make sure, right? There's a couple Carolinas, but there's only one, right? There's only one UNC. So I met Shruti when I was 20, 16 years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah,
something like that.
something like that. Yeah. And she is now a venture capitalist. She was the former MoveLoot CEO and co-founder. She has been the entrepreneur in residence for Silicon Valley Bank, Nike, um, and also serves as a fractional COO as well. And so, again, Shruti, thanks for taking the time to meet today and share, your experience. So, was there anything I missed?
No, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. So yeah, let's get started from the top. This is before I met you, obviously, right? So, what was it like growing up in Tennessee?
Great question. Well, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, which is I would consider to be the deep South. But I um, was the adopted daughter of an Indian immigrant and a Jewish New Yorker from the Bronx. And my parents moved to Memphis because my mom's job moved right before I was born. And Memphis it was a really interesting place to grow up. I really, I think it's a city that has had a lot of trials and tribulations, particularly when it comes to racism and a lot of the civil rights history is kind of very rich in Memphis, and I think that that is still playing out in different ways today. But Memphis was a really I was very fortunate to go to a public high school that was very diverse, and that pulled kids from all over the city that had many different backgrounds. And I think that was a really incredible experience for me as a kid to be around just truly amazing and brilliant kids who came from all walks of life. And so I think that that experience, I had gone to private school until I was in eighth grade, and that experience really shaped, or I guess gave me an understanding of kind of the complexity of race and how that shows up in society and all of those things. And then I think also was just such a magical experience for somebody who was growing up in an interracial household in the South at that time.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, I didn't even know you grew up in Memphis. My fiance's family is from Memphis, and not sure about uh white people, but I know most of the black people are from Arkansas.
Yep.
They're not directly from Memphis because Arkansas is like right across the water, right? Um, yeah, that's Memphis is going through a lot right now. I know particularly just I pay attention to the music scene. Famous rappers have been getting killed. But it seems like you obviously have had a different experience in Memphis, but it's definitely known for like blues, right? Is there anything else that Memphis is known for? I know like hot chicken or something like that.
Um, you know, Culturally, yeah, I would say blues music. I mean, Elvis Presley was from Memphis. I think
Graceland, yeah.
the other thing, and also it's where Dr. King was killed. So the National Civil Rights Museum is like, a pretty central place in the city. I think the other thing that's interesting from an industry perspective is Memphis is home to the headquarters of AutoZone, International Paper, and FedEx. So the airport in Memphis, while I would say that the commercial flights that you can take as a passenger commercial flights are not, uh, it doesn't have the best passenger flight uh, situation, but the FedEx uses the Memphis airport as its hub for routing packages all over the world, and so there's just a huge supply chain and logistics infrastructure that exists. There are a lot of shipping companies, and part of that I think is its location. It's right on the Mississippi River, and so and it's closer to the Midwest. So there's just a lot of it's kind of a central transport hub, I guess you could say.
Yeah, yeah. I didn't know that about International Paper. I didn't know they were headquartered there. Um, so yeah, so what is it like, growing up with two parents from different cultures? Because I know the way that your mother family communicates, the way she communicates different from your dad and his family. So how did juggle that and
Navigate that.
yeah.
I think it was hard. I mean, I think that the reality is that, we were growing up as American kids, and one parent that had immigrated to the US and had lived in the US for a long time, but even my mom grew up in New York City, and so she just had a very kind of different outlook and approach to the world. And um, I will say one thing that my parents did really well was that we were really fortunate to be exposed to a lot. So we traveled a lot as a family. We spent a lot of time with people from many different cultures because by the nature of us being kind of in the middle or like mixed, a mixed race family, we really probably didn't have a good sense of like where we fit. And so I think that exposure was really unique because it kind of lets you be a little bit of a chameleon. You can kind of fit in different places and uh, and start to kind of experience the world from different people's points of view, which was really valuable. But I would be lying if I said that there weren't challenges that came with it, especially around cultural expectations and you know how you um, how you talk to your parents, how you treat them, how you you know what I think even their approaches to like discussing, whether or not it was okay to do something was so different. Where my mom might be more open to a conversation culturally, my dad was like, "Well, I don't think you should do that." So the answer is no, and there's no discussion about it, which I think is just a cultural. I think in Asian families, there's a different um, deference that's given to parents than I think in kind of American families, and then I think, from a religious perspective, I mentioned that I went to a private school until I was in eighth grade. And it was a Christian school. So I got a heavy dose of Bible study and chapel. And then that was, I guess you could say, evened out with a lot of Hebrew school and, attending synagogue. And then, on occasion, we would spend time with the Indian community and participate in kind of Indian cultural festivities. So it was I think when people ask me about my childhood, I often use the word confused. Um, and I think for a long time I was, but I think in retrospect it was really helpful. Um, it was I mean, I think I am who I am because of it. And so I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's really cool. I grew up in one religion, so bouncing between couple. I don't know. I kind of consider um Islam, Judaism, and Christianity effectively similar. They share a lot of stories, but we'll save that conversation for another day because that can go so many ways, right? But um, so when did you decide that you wanted to actually go to Carolina? What was that process
Mm,
like?
great question. So I applied to a bunch of schools, and I think early on, my dad and I flew to Durham or to Chapel Hill, and we went to visit UNC. And I went on a campus tour. I think I met with a couple of professors, and I remember thinking, this seems like a really cool college campus. And it was a beautiful day. It was October, but it was like a beautiful October day. And I think I just, I think at the back of my head, I was like, but I don't want to go to school in the South. And this is the only school in the South that I'm applying to. And we'll see if I even get in. Um, and I think maybe in the back of my head knew that like this was probably where I was going to end up, but wasn't quite sure that I was ready to admit it to myself. And then sure enough, I got in early action or early, whatever the term was. I can't remember exactly, but
Early. Yeah.
I
And
found out pretty early that I'd gotten accepted to UNC and still waited until April to make a final decision. But I think one of the things that when I was applying to college, I knew a handful of older kids who had applied to a lot of the schools that I applied to, and some of whom ended up at UNC, and they were so everyone that I'd ever talked to that went to Carolina just raved about it. Like it was like this place is magical, everyone loves it. We're all so happy to be here. There's this incredible mix of both, academics and fun and I hadn't heard that about a lot of the other schools. There was always a drawback or like this is great, but and I think for me that felt like really good confirmation that maybe that was UNC was the place for me.
yeah, yeah. So I got to ask you about one of my favorite days in Carolina or craziest days. When Obama actually won.
Yes.
What were you doing? I'm gonna tell you what I was doing, but what were you doing after when you found out Obama won, and then what did you do afterwards?
Oh, I ran to Franklin Street. I think as many people did. And there was a whole crowd of us on Franklin Street. I remember there was a guy with a boombox who had like put the boombox on his shoulder and he was playing because we started listening to his acceptance speech and then kind of ran to Franklin Street. But the whole street was quiet and everybody was just listening to the speech. It was pretty magical, like
Yeah.
just an incredible moment. And, I had been kind of sort of tangentially involved with some of the um, get out the vote efforts, like had been, in the Young Democrats Club or something like that. And they, I would say, are largely responsible for having swung the election for Obama in North Carolina, because at the time you could register to vote on election day. And they just did such an incredible job of getting people to register to vote leading up to the election, but on election day. And I do believe that had a huge impact in getting Obama those electoral votes. But it was really an incredible day.
Yeah. So funny thing about me. So I'm from a small town, Goldsboro, right? So I'm in gosh, what I'm trying to think what library that was, right? Um the library adjacent to the student union. So you got the student union and then that library there, and then you have the place where the food court is and stuff.
The undergraduate library or Davis Library,
I think it
one of
was
them.
Davis.
Okay.
And so I had a counting class at 8 a.m. the next day. And so I'm studying for that. I guess I was studying for that, but I'm also looking at CNN, the tracker or whatever. And so I remember I hit refresh, and it was just like a kind of like a wide. It was neck and neck, and then I hit refresh again, and then it was just like boom, right? I remember looking like, oh my god, like So I'm still studying, and I start hearing all this commotion and stuff, people running. And so me and my small town mind frame, I'm like, I'm not running to Franklin Street. Like, we don't do this in Goldsboro. Like, the cops are gonna lock everybody up because this is actually my first year. Yeah, that was my first year there. I think I had been in Carolina for like 6 months because I transferred in. And I remember going on Facebook and I'm like, where do these people get this TV? Like, I saw people carrying TVs and stuff. Like, I saw all my friends on Facebook, they were just having a ball. And it was funny. I ended up going to class the next day and like nobody was there. I'm like, why am I here? Yeah. But
Yep.
yeah, I didn't know you were I didn't know you were involved with that much in the in getting people to vote and stuff and register. But I do remember
Yeah.
the Democrats. I do remember them.
Yeah. I did a little bit of campaigning while I was there, but I would not say that. I mean, I knew people who were way more involved than I was and who I think really were owning the strategy around all of it. And it was pretty incredible to watch.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I want to go back to what you were saying about the I think it's very, very a useful skill that you have now, right? The fact that you grew up in a, two-parent home, different cultures. How did that, how did that help you excel at Carolina? But then also, how does that permeate today with you being a venture capitalist?
Yeah, I think it's helped me find comfort in what might otherwise be characterized as uncomfortable situations,
Yeah,
because I know how to exist in spaces where my experiences are very different than other people's. Doesn't mean it doesn't sometimes come with its challenges, but I think that I it gave me this kind of chameleon like ability to be in different spaces.
right, right. Yeah. Um, so cool. So you and me and you met because I think you majored in economics. I majored in economics, but I'm minoring in the entrepreneurship
Yeah,
program.
an entrepreneurship program.
That's how we actually met. So I remember, I always saw you as like, oh, she's gonna be like a great social entrepreneur. She's gonna, launch a nonprofit. And then it's funny, I end up moving to the Bay Area. Um, and then I don't know where we ended up bumping into each other or something like that.
I feel like
Um,
it was at a party or something.
Probably, yeah, because everybody in the Bay knows everybody, especially if you work in tech. It's like a 3 degree of separation. And then I heard about what you was doing with YC, and I'm like, wow, when is she? Okay. I was like, okay. So kind of fill me in on that gap. Like what happened like post college, and then what was your entry into YC, and then obviously starting. Um,
Yeah, so post college, well, after college, I actually moved to Baltimore and I was a public school teacher in Baltimore for a couple of years. And while I was teaching, I got really interested in the role that technology was playing in the classroom, largely because I saw this kind of opportunity gap. I was teaching in a school in Southeast Baltimore, which traditionally is a neighborhood that has a lot of kids that come from kind of a um, really under resourced or kind of low socioeconomic background. And the school itself was not equipped with Wi-Fi. So we were still using Ethernet cables to get internet. The computers, I had one computer in my classroom, and it was the same computer that existed in the elementary school that I went to. And the computer lab was filled with these old iMacs, the same ones I used as a kid. And so there just seemed to me to be a real opportunity gap when it came to the types of technology that the kids I was teaching had access to. And so I started trying to use a lot of tools in my classroom and built a lot of relationships with ed tech entrepreneurs. This was kind of the beginning of what ultimately became a real boom in ed tech. And so I ended up working with a lot of these entrepreneurs and giving them product feedback, and then also training a lot of teachers in my school on how to incorporate some of these tools into their classroom. And after a couple of years of teaching, where I kind of felt like, actually, I think maybe this is a direction that I could be interested in or go in, I ended up getting a couple of job offers to move to San Francisco and work for early stage ed tech companies, and then also got an offer at an early stage fund that was doing seed stage ed tech investing. So I ended up taking the job at the fund because I thought it would give me kind of a high level view of what was happening in ed tech. And it did. It was a really cool experience. And it was, my first foray into the tech world and what that looks like. And I don't know if you remember San Francisco in 2012, 2013, but it was this kind of magical environment where I think many people felt like anything was possible. There was a lot of capital flowing to startups. There was a lot of optimism. Um, and so that was a really cool environment to be a part of. And I think the contrast of being in an environment like that after having been in a public school in Baltimore for 2 years was pretty jarring for me. Because I think there were days that I felt like this wasn't reality. And that this was a place that, while fun to be part of this energy, just was lacking a connection to the way the rest of the world lived. So that I think was a hard, I mean, I would say my first year living in San Francisco, I kind of struggled with that. But I worked at the New Schools Venture Seed Fund, which is now a firm called Capital, for a little while. And then at the same time, really caught my own startup bug. I was really um, uh, interested in, what it would take to build a company. And I had three friends who had also had an experience of moving across the country where we all sold our furniture in one place and basically bought the same furniture in another. And we kind of started thinking like maybe there has to be a better way to do this. And we were all, the same age, we had the same number of years of work experience. And I think we're trying to figure out like, is this the right time to maybe start a company? And we did some market research, we did user interviews, we launched this Indiegogo campaign to raise a little bit of money, and found ourselves, within that first year of living in San Francisco, emailing people on Craigslist and telling them we'd pick up their stuff and that we were this new startup called MoveLoot that wanted to help people buy and sell their used furniture. And so pretty soon after we did that, we applied to Y-Combinator. We got in, which I think floored all of us, but nevertheless, it was probably the biggest game-changing factor for us in terms of thinking about growth, and also giving us some market validation that allowed us to go on to raise a $2.8 million seed round. And then from there to continue to raise capital in two more rounds of funding. And, MoveLoot was a wild ride. We seemingly grew from, 4 people to over 300 in about a year and a half. We had warehouses and trucks and physical operations in a bunch of states. And it was truly an incredible adventure and learning experience that came with also a lot of trials and tribulations. But the short answer on what happened with MoveLoot is that we ended up changing the model in an effort to try to grow more quickly, and it really just didn't work the way that we had hoped. So we ended up kind of winding things down, selling a piece of the business, but it ultimately didn't have the outcome I think that any of us had hoped that it would.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible. So you moved to the Bay 3 years before me, but I do remember that time because it's like online, the Bay was like the darling. And it actually wasn't that expensive that at the time. It's still, even though people were complaining about how much more expensive it was becoming. There's one thing I that you said about being a teacher, that I just thought of a question, and then we can go back to your experience around MoveLoot, going from like 4 to 300 people. But I've heard similar things about the school system in Memphis and then also in Baltimore. I guess what are some things that you think, and I think you kind of touched on it, but more updated technology. But what are like some other things you think that can actually help the school system in
Yeah,
Baltimore, in Memphis?
totally. Well, I'm now almost 14 years out of being a teacher,
Yeah.
which is kind of crazy to think about. But I think that one of the things that I think about a lot is just infrastructure. I mean, so, the tools are great and they do enable kind of creating more tailored or uh, personalized learning. But if you don't have Wi-Fi, if you don't have connectivity in your schools, and you don't have the budget to update that kind of physical infrastructure, that's a real challenge. And so, I think the other thing is a lot of schools invest or have invested, even in Baltimore and in Memphis, like have invested a lot of money into hardware, smart boards, all sorts of tablets and other types of technology. And I think one thing we don't plan for often enough or think about often enough is like, what are the pieces in a budget that need to be allocated for the ongoing updates, new, or of the software for those products, or kind of getting new hardware in the door when it's needed. Because I think technology is moving so quickly that oftentimes I think schools can find themselves in a position of using outdated tools, which, doesn't give students a competitive advantage in the long run.
Yeah. And add to that, I would also adding some type of economic stability to the parents of, of these kids, right, in these lower economic areas. Um,
Completely.
because like if you're hungry, right, you're not really going to grasp the subject matter that you're learning, or that is being presented to you. And just speaking from my personal experience, I remember growing up in Goldsboro and stuff and taking a geometry class in high school, and I'm like, I didn't really, well, how is this relevant to my life? And then now, like, I love, African history in particularly Egypt. And then you look at the pyramids, and that's all, geometry. So how do teachers, and then obviously teachers are underfunded too, they're not paid enough, right? So but how do you make these subjects more relevant to kids, right? At
Yep.
various age,
Completely.
so it's like when I started learning about the pyramids, and we still haven't figured out how they got built. I'm like, wow, they knew the Pythagorean theorem before the guy who coined the phrase. He learned it from Egypt, actually. So but yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. So one of the things I also, want to touch on, you mentioned you all went from 4 to 300 people in a year and a half. Like, I just don't want to breathe through that, because that's, now you go from having to remember four people's names to maybe 300, or no, you're one of them. So 299 people, right? Um, so, what was that like? Like, how did you, because you have to also change, not necessarily change who you are, but now you're not a founder anymore. Now you're more of an executive. So like, kind of talk me through what are some things you did to adjust, or to be able to
Yeah.
go on a roller coaster.
Well, the learning curve there is steep when you're 25 years old. And I think for us, it was a couple of things. I think one was coaching. We had executive coaches individually and as a team. We also brought in other executives. I mean, I think really quickly, and one thing that I think is so critical for any growing organization is like, you can be the person, you can be the founder of the organization, but your sweet spot at some point has to be around holding the vision for the company and then bringing in people who are a whole lot smarter than you to run it. And I think I find often, especially now as an investor, like that sometimes that is a hard jump for people to make because it feels like you're giving up this thing that you created that feels in so many ways like it's part of you. But at the end of the day, I think you have the highest probability of success if you kind of start to relinquish control, hold the vision, be a coach and a supporter of the people that you hire. But at the end of the day, you want people who can really be experts in helping you drive the business forward. So I think that was really critical for us. And then I think, all of the um, ways in which you have to like learn how to care for yourself, which I think you learn a lot about in your 20s, right? But like not abandoning things like eating well and exercising and going to therapy and all of those things, I think were really critical in helping us manage all of the moving pieces.
Yeah, and then obviously I would add to that relationships, right? Like,
Yep.
not being too stuck in your grind to call your parents, or your well, you're the only child, right?
No, I have a little sister.
Little sister. Okay.
Yeah.
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 Um, right, like checking in, because like now, I would, when I was in the Bay, and just early on in life, I would just work like a dog, and then just like
Mhm.
only talk to people and family when something came up, right? So I'm glad you touched on that in therapy too, right? Like,
Yeah,
mental health is wealth, right? So
completely.
um so we kind of touched on it. You applied to YC, but for people who don't know, what is YC, or Y Combinator? Um, and why are founders so, I would actually still consider YC the number one. I would probably see 500 Startups as number two. I think 500 Startups has a better international reach, but YC is probably the most respected. But what is Y Combinator, and why are like founders like really rushing to get into
Yeah.
Y Combinator?
Well, so YC is an accelerator program for early stage companies. And basically, the idea is that you join the program and you spend 12 weeks just focused solely on growing your business. And the whole premise behind it is that you receive some coaching and you're part of a small group of other founders who can kind of be sounding boards for your ideas, but you're running kind of a series of tests. You have hypotheses about how to grow your business. You run those tests while you're in YC, and ideally, you end up with a graph that you can show at demo day, which is when they invite investors from the larger startup community to come, and you're showing them an up into the right graph with the hopes of perhaps raising money. I think what YC has become is so much more than that. I think demo day is valuable if what you're looking to do is raise money, but now YC writes a larger check than they used to. They write a 500K check to every company. So some companies are leaving YC not necessarily needing to raise capital immediately, but they still have the video clips of them kind of giving a pitch. And then I think even more than that, the network is now probably one of the most influential networks of startup founders, and there's a lot of collaboration that happens between YC companies. A lot of YC companies, for example, were our first customers when they needed office furniture for their new offices. But that has had kind of macro effects as the founder community has grown. I mean, I think when I joined YC, there were less than 1,000 people that had ever gone through it. It might have been somewhere between 500 and 600 founders. Today, I think it's maybe well over 5,000. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure that it's grown pretty exponentially. And so it's just a really amazing forum for learning about really what's happening in the startup world, but also it's a place where, like, even after, if your company is still not even in business, you're still part of this community of founders who all have had this shared experience and who, are really supportive and helpful of each other.
Yeah, yeah. And one of my, you remember Zad, right? You remember Zad Faruque?
Mm-hmm.
He was a part of so he actually joined, he was a part of YC's third class. And so when I went to UNC, he had just left YC. And he was coming back to class, and he like I remember he put out a I think I was unemployed at the time when I knew we were living in an apartment, and he sent out an email, and I got so many like um interview requests. I was like, wow, this network was crazy. And this is 2018.
Yeah,
When he sent it out, I was like, wow. But yeah, the network is crazy. I'm like, just to be on accessing that network alone, it's worth his weight in gold. So
totally.
yeah. So what are some top do's or don'ts for when you're filling out your application to YC? Because I know a lot of people watching are probably more on that end, the application piece, and there's already been a ton of research, but we'd love to get your thoughts on that. What are some top do's and don'ts
Yes.
with your application?
First thing I would say is read and take seriously. I think there's a document that's like, yeah, this is how to be successful with a YC application. But I think one of the most common mistakes I see people make is that when they fill out that application, they write long paragraphs that are very marketing speak forward, where you don't actually really understand what the company does, but you're using a lot of tech jargon and um, flowery language, and it's just not clear what you do or who you are. And the most important things that YC is looking for is who is the founding team. The idea is important. The idea that you're thinking about the opportunity in a big way is important. But really, it's like, who is this team and why do they have expertise to solve this problem? And what are their kind of skill sets? And so just being as clear as you can about who you are, and where you're headed, and doing it in a way that is concise, I think is really the key.
Mm, when you were saying that, it's like I feel like that came directly from like Sam. Sam was the former president, right, of YC. I saw him in the interview. It just made me think of that. The interviewer asked him something. He was just like, I don't want to answer that question. I forgot what it was. It was about Oh, I know what it was. It was about the potential ills of AI, and I guess he had got tired of
Of answering that question.
yeah. He's like, I'm not answering that question. But but yeah, I'm glad you said that, because what I've actually found, particularly like in tech at times, is that if you don't know certain words, then people don't take you serious, right? And it seemed, I remember there was like a good mix. And I think there's a lot of doers and people who obviously have good intentions, but I noticed like if you didn't use certain phrases or words, people didn't really take you serious. So that's refreshing to hear. Like, just keep it simple, talk about the team, no, it's funny you said flowery language. So I thought that was funny. Flowery language.
I think the other thing about it is that like that is actually a principle that I think should apply generally when you're thinking about pitching your business. Like it's something I talk to founders about all the time, which is that I just want you to explain this to me like you would explain it to a 10-year-old. And that I think is sometimes useful framing because it's not that we're trying to dumb it down. It's just that at the end of the day, the people that are going to buy your product or service need to understand what it does and they need to understand that in a very clear way. And so using jargon and flowery language, I think can sometimes uh, deter people from actually understanding what it is that you do.
Yeah, because it can sound like you don't either know what you're doing or like you're hiding something or
Yep.
you're exaggerating, right?
Yep.
So basically you like to be pitched as if you're not writing them a check. That's kind of somewhat what I'm hearing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Um, so what were the biggest lessons that you learned from MoveLoot and that you took and that actually helped you be good at entrepreneur in residence when you were working at, I think it was Nike, and what is Silicon Valley Bank. What are like some things that you pulled from your MoveLoot experience?
Great question. I feel like I learned a lot of lessons from that experience. At SVB, I actually got to spend a lot of time reflecting on my MoveLoot experience and spoke at a lot of conferences, got to work with founders one on one. And so that for me was really an opportunity to start to distill some of those lessons into things that might be useful for other people so that people might avoid some of the mistakes that we made. But, so much of that was around like how you hire well and um, how you manage a board, how you raise money, how you explain concepts in clear and concise um, phrases or manners, and also a big learning experience when you grow a team to that size is like how do you create systems and processes in an organization so that people know what's happening, that people feel bought in. I don't think we did that perfectly by any means, but I think I learned a lot about how you do that well. And I think that's a lot of the experience now that I get to translate into my work as kind of a fractional COO, where I spend a lot of time with companies working on different projects, and then also in my time as a investor. So I spend a lot of time with our founders thinking about the culture piece and what that looks like, in addition to what are their growth goals and where are they headed.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. I like the fact that you said um the way you communicate with a small team is it changes when you go from 300. And I was just recently at a company that went from 125 when I joined, and then when I left, it was like 500 people, right? And just seeing that change, um, because you do have to develop those processes. And one thing I found from working at startups is that sometimes, or when you're going through that growth phase, is that those silos are there. So if you're not the type of person that's communicating with a lot of people, you really miss out on a lot of information. But I'm glad you pointed that out. Like, hey, build these systems to make it easy to communicate and make sure everybody is on the same page and gets the vision. Um, cool. So you decided to start your VC company. Where did the name Symphonic come from? Symphonic Capital. I actually like that.
Yeah.
feel like a lot of I feel like a lot of VCs, and just people in general don't understand branding, right? And like it just Symphonic Capital, like it just flows very well. But yeah, we'd
Yeah.
love to hear how you came up with the name, how you all came because you have a partner, right?
Yeah, so Sydney Thomas is the founder of Symphonic, and she's incredible. And she and I were became friends when I was working at SBB, and she asked me to join the team. And as she was launching the fund, and we really, I mean, Symphonic is actually, I think it's a reflection of us in that we are both music lovers. We love going to concerts, and we have, I think, a long list on both of our ends of artists that we really love. But also, I think it speaks to what we're trying to build, which is that like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That we're an organization that wants to help build and cultivate other organizations, and that the symphony aspect of that is what's most important. So it's not about one person, but about a group of people or a group of instruments working together to create something really amazing.
When you said that, I'm like, oh, that's a violin. Cool, cool. So I think you already touched on it, but what is a venture capital firm and what is the goal of venture capitalists? Um,
Yeah. So venture capital is a type of financing for a business that has the potential to have high growth in a short period of time. So, I think it can best be described as rocket fuel. It should be used as funding that um, is backing an idea that has really large potential in terms of um, where it could go. And so I say that because I think our default in American society, you look at big iconic companies that have been built like Uber or Lyft or Facebook, and they've all raised venture capital. And I think that the default belief is that is how you build a business. And actually, there are many ways to build a business, and probably ways that are uh, more economical for you as an individual, and also allow you to own more of the making in your company if you don't take venture capital. So I think, um, you know, venture capital firms exist to invest capital, usually on behalf of LPs, limited partners, who are pooling their money into a fund because they believe that the partners investing that capital have access to certain networks, they have a certain investment thesis, a certain approach that allows them to be um, thoughtful about the types of businesses that they're investing in, and ultimately provide an outsized return on that invested capital to those limited partners. And so that is that's really how VC works, and that's kind of our approach and philosophy. But I think we're a little bit different too, in that we care a lot about, and we spend a lot of time asking about the impact on under-resourced or underrepresented communities, which is really important.
yeah, yeah. So I like that you said economical and you're like, well, you actually own it because I've spoken to a lot of founders who raise a lot of money, and because they raise so much money, they lost board seats and were kicked out, or they don't have as much of they don't get as much as the upside. I think Groupon is a great example of that. I think their lead investor, I think he ended up getting 70% of their um shares. He ended up getting more shares than the actual founder of it. So when you're talking to someone, yeah, I want to phrase it like this. Yeah. So whenever you're talking to someone who's pitching you or not using flowery language, let's say that, right? What are some red flags for you, right? When you're like, I think I'm gonna pass on this person, or um, you know, what are those red flags for you when you're like, hey, this person needs more work, or maybe further down the road, this person will be a better fit for us?
Yeah, I think one red flag is a general desire to prioritize raising capital over building a product and getting customers. I think
Mm,
one thing that I often find is that there are people that they seem very focused on raising money and less focused on this is when we're shipping the product, here are proof points around the business. And that's a red flag because, you know, at the end of the day, we want you to build a good business, and capital is important, but it shouldn't be the most important thing. So having an orientation towards building the product, I think also perfectionism, which I think can sometimes show up in an inability to ship product quickly. Um, we can design the most beautiful product in the world and do all the user research in the world. And at the end of the day, if no one's using what you are putting out into the world, it will be meaningless. And so I think one thing is like uh, founder perfection around wanting to spend as much time as possible um, getting everything perfect, because it's not going to be perfect. And you're going to learn a lot, actually, a lot more about how to adapt the product um, as you get it out into the world and have people use it. And so I think an orientation towards that is really important. You know, I think overall, what I look for, what we look for, is just curiosity. I think the best founders are people who are just constantly curious about their customer, about where the business is going. They're asking questions. They're open to feedback, um, and they also are able to be really thoughtful about discerning. I mean, I'll use some jargony language, but the signal from the noise. I think the hardest part about being an entrepreneur is that you're getting a lot of advice and feedback. And the best entrepreneurs are people who can say, here's all the information I have. And even then it's a complete, it's an incomplete set of information. And this is actually what resonates for me and my business and where I want to go.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you pointed it out. And I think that has been a systematic issue with tech and just fundraising. Like I remember like the early 10s, 2010s, just read these tech front stories about so and so raised this, so and so raised that. Um, and we actually, me and my people in our inner circle, we actually called it tech porn because that skewed to where it's just like, and I remember at a time when I was living in the Bay, when I would talk to people who were founders, the first thing they said was, "Oh, we raised X." Like that was a validator. Like, yeah, take me serious because I just raised like 30 million, right? Or however much million. Um, but yeah, that definitely refreshing to hear you. Like, you know, are you really trying to build a business? Are you not trying to perfect your product, or but are you building a product to actually solve a real problem? Um, which kind of leads me to my next question: how has venture capital um, changed in this new environment? Right. So when you moved to the Bay, when I was there as well, we were in we talked about this like a few days ago. We were in a high interest rate, I mean, a low interest rate environment with the Fed uh, kept interest rates low. And so a lot of that extra cash went into tech, right? Uber benefited, Lyft, all these, if you look at the past 10 years, um, right, in that regime, those tech companies benefited. So how has that changed now that we're in a higher interest rate environment? How have you seen that change the way that yourself and just venture capitalists do business?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that there's a few things that are noticeably different. I think first is I think the proof points are higher. I think you can't just raise money on an idea. I'm thinking about there was an app, maybe you remember this, but at some point there was this app in Silicon Valley called the Yo app. And all it was you downloaded the app and then it would just say yo, like, and I think they raised like $3 million off that idea, right? And that's just not, you just don't see stuff like that getting funded anymore. I think now it's really uh, a much more structured approach to investing. And I think particularly like seed and series A investors are really looking at what are the proof points around the user and the potential for this business that are really, really critical. Um, the other thing that I'll say is that um, I think that, in the last cycle, a lot of companies were able to stay private for a long period of time. So they kept raising large mega rounds and they stayed private and then they went public. And there was a huge discrepancy between how they were valued on the private market and how they're being valued on the public market. And I think venture capitalists are taking note of that now. I mean, obviously, many of them did well in that scenario, but even so, like, it just, I think, is really sad to see that some of these companies that at one point were valued at billions and billions of dollars basically took huge haircuts on their value. I mean, WeWork is a prime example of that. but
Yeah.
there are numerous others that really have struggled as public companies. And so I think that there is a bit of a reckoning around, okay, what what does it actually take to be successful in the long run? And it's probably not these overinflated valuations. It's probably not, you know, being valued at 10x of what you're worth. But how do we help businesses grow in a realistic way that ultimately gets them to a place where they can IPO, but that they can be successful in the long term?
Got it. Got it. Um, and then one thing and me and you can go back and forth in this, but so there's different types of founders who should raise, or when they look at fundraising, should use different type of tactics, right? Like, so if it's a first time founder who's doing primarily like a software startup, right? They probably should focus more on building if it makes sense, if they have that capability, and then looking at raising money later. If it's like a successful entrepreneur that's proven, they probably can. Well, they probably wouldn't do the Yo app. I think that was before I came to the Bay, but that's really funny.
Okay.
But that kind of shows you, I think that's a perfect story around what it was like in the Bay. Like everything was getting funded if you were connected. Um, but yeah, so back
Yep.
to my point, if you're an experienced entrepreneur or founder, right, you can probably raise money on just an idea because you have a proven track record, or depending on what industry, right? Some industries are more capital extensive, like uh, industries that involve some type of engine, or if you're building like semiconductors, right? There's a lot of upfront costs. We'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that, how someone should go about thinking about their fundraising opportunities.
I would say explore all your options, right? Like there are a lot of ways to raise money for a business that don't involve giving up huge amounts of equity. And that could be invoice factoring, that could be traditional debt financing. Frankly, I'm a huge fan of crowdfunding. I think crowdfunding has really changed the game when it comes to being able to raise money for a startup. Still means you might give up equity, but I've seen all sorts of different structures with equity, with crowdfunding agreements. You can do revenue-based financing, you know, where you get the money that you need and then you pay back the investment using a percentage of revenue. So I would just really encourage founders to think about like what makes sense for my business and our growth trajectory. And it might be that like you're going to build a big business, but it's going to take you 15 years to get there, and does that mean venture capital is the right type of financing? Maybe not, but are there other ways to do it? And I think, if you feel like you've really figured something out about how to grow your business using VC, then by all means go for it. But I would also say explore your options.
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad you put it that way. Because yeah, I think it also boils down to, you have to understand the economics of your business, right? It so if you have, and I'm just kind of throwing this out there, if you have a higher gross margin, then it may be more advantageous to take a loan and to beef up the value of your company. So then when you do raise around, you don't have to give up as much equity. Um, which kind of leads me to my next point. So what's the difference between pre-seed and then seed and then series A, B, C, D? What's the primary difference between the two? Because when you look at it now, it's somewhat blurred, but what are the difference between pre-seed and kind of everything else?
Yeah, great question. Um, I would say so pre-seed, I mean, I think has a broad definition, depending on who you talk to. For us, pre-seed means that we don't invest pre-product, but we could invest pre-revenue. And so the idea is that you might have a product already in market, but you're not yet charging customers. So we might be interested in investing, but really pre-seed is like the earliest stage of your business. It's also the stage that YC usually invest, although sometimes they do later stage. Seed is you have some more traction and some more customers, and you're learning a lot from your customers and you're adapting your product. And then I think of Series A as like you are a full-fledged business and you know your unit economics, you know what it takes to scale. You can tell a growth story that is attractive to a venture capitalist. And you need that growth capital to really fuel your business. And then, as we talked about, like people have continued to raise Series B and Series C and Series D as they've been able to stay private longer.
Right.
But I'm also curious about how long that's going to stay in place. It used to be, I think maybe companies would raise to Series B and then they would go public. Um, but really, Series A and Series B are really about the growth story and what you're telling investors who are evaluating a fully fledged business that has, a long Rolodex of customers.
Right. Yeah, and I remember like, and I'm thinking back to when interest rates were like really low. I remember the line became really blurred between what a seed was and what a Series A, because those things kind of combined. Like where someone would say, "Oh, I just raised 10 million in my seed," and I'm thinking, well, that's more probably like a Series A, right? Or
Yeah, exactly.
if you look at GitHub, I think GitHub did one round, which was technically like a seed, but the amount of money they raised, I think it was like 20 or 40 million. That's technically basically a series B. Um,
Yep.
right. Yeah, and it sounds like what you're saying now, or kind of what I'm thinking, since we're in a higher interest rate environment, there are probably not going to be as many Series C and up rounds. It's probably going to
Yep.
be max B and maybe C. But I remember for a while I was like, wow, these are they going to go all the way to Z? Like,
Yeah, exactly. Totally. It's
yeah,
a totally different ballgame in that case.
yeah. Um, so you kind of touched on it, but I want to take it a step further. So when you're looking at an investment opportunity, right? What's the multiple you on average go for, and what's the time frame that you're actually looking to hold your investment in said startup or company?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at ideally a 7x plus multiple on our investment, right? I mean, that's what our modeling says, and that's true for venture capital. I will say venture capital is the highest risk asset class. So there are actually very few funds that fully achieve that. But we're looking, because we invest so early and our timeline is about, between 10 and 12 years. That's what we're looking at from a multiple perspective.
Got it. And I'm assuming also that when you're looking at company to invest in, you're also thinking about, okay, we believe in this company, but we also believe there's potential for them to do a later round or be later profitable in the future, right? Does that also go into your consideration? Because obviously you got a network, and it just makes it a lot easier for you if you make a great investment, and then you can say, hey, guys and girls, you should also look at this. Is that also how you're considering it as
Yeah,
well?
we definitely think about it that way. I think we also think about, because we're so early, and I think this happens for a lot of early stage investors, there's often opportunities, depending on how long the company stays private, for early stage investors to sell their stake to later stage investors if there needs to be more room made in the round. So that's not our goal by any means, but that is kind of something that happens sometimes with venture capital.
Yeah, yeah.
Also,
I'm trying to think what I was going to ask. Oh, so yeah, so now you live in Durham. What was like the driving force to move to Durham? Um,
great
After
question.
living in the Bay, like how can you go from there to there, like in Bay?
Yeah, we went to school in Chapel Hill, and I think I had a lot of friends who, during the pandemic, were thinking about moving back to North Carolina. And I think for me, MoveLoot, we actually had a big office here when we were running MoveLoot, and so I spent a lot of time here um, when we were running MoveLoot and really loved it, and just wanted to be. I think for me, wanted to find a way to feel grounded and kind of a community that I really loved, but also still have access to the professional world that I had built. Um, so um, I think that was a big driver behind it. And it's been such an amazing transition. I think I've just really loved living here and being part of a community that I have loved for a long time, but also, um, I still travel frequently. I'm still back in the Bay very often. And so getting to have kind of the best of both worlds is really wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. So what have you noticed and I know this kind of may be like a bad comparison because now we're kind of comparing different times, but how would you describe the the RTP tech scene, Raleigh Durham, Chapel Hill tech scene versus the tech scene in the Bay? Like, what are like the major differences that you notice between the two?
You know, um, a lot of I think the biggest thing is that the tech scene here is still very much growing and emerging. So we're not yet, I think, fully formed in the way that you have kind of uh, a lot more developed companies out in San Francisco or even in New York. But I think that there's a lot of potential here, and so a lot of the big tech companies have offices here. There's a lot of talent that has moved to this area because it's such a wonderful place to live, um, and I think that with it is bringing kind of a lot of new ideas and opportunity for people to build great companies.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, and then this is no slight against the RTP scene, but the reason why what drove me to move to the Bay was that I noticed that Raleigh, very similar, or the RTP um tech scene, like a lot of tech scenes at that time, we're trying to emulate um Silicon Valley or the Bay Area. And so my thing was, how about I just move there? Um, do you think that what you are seeing in Durham is more, do you think the scene now is still trying to emulate the Bay Area, or do you think it's really trying to be its own thing and kind of develop its own like culture, tech culture, I guess you can say?
Um, I think it's probably a combination of both. I think it's like taking the good stuff that exists there, but also allowing kind of a new culture to emerge here. And I think it's also just going to take time. I mean, part of how the tech scene was built in the valley, and now we're whatever 40 years into it. There have been multiple cycles. It's just that people made a lot of money and then they invest, and their employees made a lot of money and they invested that money back into the ecosystem. And so you kind of need some of those network effects to take place here, to be able to keep growing the tech scene.
Got it. Is there a particular, and I have an idea on this, but want to hear your thoughts. Is there particular industries that will do better, tech industries or type of tech companies that would do better in Durham or Raleigh versus any other scene? Like I know Boston is known for, I want to say, is it health tech or ed tech? Like there's certain
Health tech.
areas, yeah, health tech. There's certain areas of the country where like if you got a consumer product, tech product, go to the Bay, right? Go to Silicon Valley. So what is that like main industry, tech industry that's like, or type of companies that tend to be
Yeah.
for Durham?
I actually think a lot of, so, North Carolina has a lot of pharmaceutical companies. There is a lot of health tech happening here, um, especially given that there's kind of three major university systems. So there's a lot of research that comes out of those universities that can turn into technology companies. And so I think, yeah, biotech, pharmaceuticals. I think also there have been manufacturing. I mean, North Carolina used to be home to a lot of the old school textile industry. And so I think manufacturing has a lot of potential here. Um, and then uh, there have been some interesting companies that are just B2B SaaS software businesses, which, given that we have like Google and Facebook and, Apple is in the process of building a campus here, um, that I think is going to bring some more engineering talent that might have that software skill set.
Right, right. And are those industries you focus on?
So we do focus on healthcare, and we also focus on fintech. And you see a lot of fintech companies come out of New York, but um, our belief is around closing access gaps for under-resourced and underrepresented communities. And so we invest in a lot of companies that have big vision around what their impact could be. We're not an impact fund, but we're looking at kind of the overall um, potential of and the demographics of who the company is serving.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, I'm glad you gave that overview of like what works there. And I remember reading the stat that the Triangle has the highest amount of PhDs per capita than anywhere in the U.S., I believe.
Yeah,
And
PhDs. Yeah, I think that's true. Yep,
they stick around. I didn't get a PhD, so I didn't stick around. Um,
exactly.
yeah. So last question. This is gonna be a hard one. What are your like top five, top five, top three music artists that you like to listen to or concerts you go to?
Oh man, this is hard. Um, I can tell you in the last year I saw Kendrick Lamar in Rwanda, which was pretty
Oh,
amazing. He
wow.
was the headliner for Global Citizens concert in Rwanda. And Sydney and I went to see Lauryn Hill in LA, which was really
Hold on.
fun.
Was she on time though? Was she on time?
She was a little late, but she was great.
Yeah.
That's always the question. And I think lately I've been really loving. There's a Palestinian American rapper named Anif who is just an incredible artist, and I really love his work and his music. And he talks a lot about self love in his music and so I just really admire it. And I think I've followed some videos that he's put out into the world, and he's just a very thoughtful artist.
Yeah.
Um, I think other people that I really like, I listen to a lot of old school stuff. So I'm a big Sam Cooke, Temptations, um,
I mean, you did grow up in
Bill
Memphis.
with yeah, I grew up
You
in
did grow up
Memphis.
in
Bill
Memphis, so that
Withers, like
makes sense. Yeah.
all of that,
Yeah.
Aretha Franklin. So I, that's usually somewhere on my Spotify during the day. And who else am I really excited about? Those are probably the big ones
Hold on, I got a
these
question.
days.
So somebody makes you mad. Do you play Aretha Franklin respect?
I should. I should just send that to them in a link. We do have a symphonic playlist that I should send to you. That's in um, our email signatures, so that people can check out our playlist, what we're listening to.
Smart. I had an idea around this is when I was doing a tech trap house in the Bay, where we basically would create a playlist as like another way to market tech trap house. So I might go back to doing that. I might create a list for trap talks and put it on Spotify and Pandora. So um still in that idea.
Great. Please steal it.
Yeah. I
Awesome.
did this one last question because I know you gotta go. What are how important do you feel what you're doing to inspire, women, particularly women of color, to get into the VC world? How do you, yeah, like how do because I think what you're doing is very important. And just from the representation, I think you're the only Indian, yeah, you're the only Indian VC I know. So so how do you, and then
Oh,
obviously, yeah, so like how do you feel about it?
I really, um, it's something that I feel is extraordinarily important. I think growing up, there were not, I mean, I think if you had asked me growing up about what my career would look like, I'm not sure I would have thought that I would have landed here. But aside from that, there weren't people who looked like me doing the work that I'm doing today. So to even have a reference point, I think is so powerful. And it's a responsibility that I take really seriously in terms of just wanting to be a supporter of other women, and particularly women of color who choose this entrepreneurial path or investing path. And, you know, I think it's so critical for people to see other people who look like them doing the things that they may aspire to do one day. And so it's an honor to be able to get to do that, um, and also a really serious responsibility.
Yeah, yeah. Lead. What was I about to say? Lead. Your representation is going to help lead others like you into the field because we need it, right? Like the things that you invest in or that you feel more aligned in is based on what you've been through, right? And your lens of how you look at things.
Exactly.
And so that's why it's important that we need um um diversity in VC spaces, right? Like who's going to um you've seen it firsthand, right? With being a teacher in Baltimore, the impacts of not having enough income, right? And so that's probably why you're more like, hey, let's work on investing in companies that help close that gap, even though they're not based in New York, right? For obvious reasons. But yeah, so let me see. I think that's it. I think that's all the questions I have. Unless there's anything else, any last minute things you want to. I know you touched on it a little bit, but if you want to talk more about your fractional COO work, and companies that
Yeah,
want to
I'm happy
contact.
to. Yeah, so I've been kind of a fractional executive for a while now, probably over 5 years, where I get to work with pretty closely with CEOs in a variety of different capacities, but usually as an embedded person on the team who can really help create the structure, systems, and processes that drive growth for the business. And so, oftentimes, what that looks like is I come in and then I end up helping hire the team and eventually hire myself out of a job. But I've gotten to work on health tech companies. I've gotten to work for large nonprofits. I've gotten to work for some fintech companies, and so it's been a lot of fun to be able to do all of that.
Perfect, perfect. And what's the best way for people to reach you if they want to pitch you, or actually, I don't want to use that word pitch, if they want to non-flowery explain what their product is looking to solve, or if they're looking for a
Yeah.
fraction, well, how can they reach out to you?
Probably the best way is either on LinkedIn or through email. So I can give you my email address.
Cool.
Should I do that now, or should I?
It's up to you. I know if I know if I'm writing checks, I'm not putting my email out there like that.
Yeah,
That's just
probably not. Yeah, but I think the best way would probably be through LinkedIn. Just reach out on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to chat.
cool, cool. Well, great, Shruti. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Thanks for watching. Again, this is Trap Talks, where we discuss the intersection of culture and tech. I'm Corey Stay Trapping, and yeah, thanks for being here. Take care.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.